The auctioneer wanted the pumpkins gone before noon, not the pretty ones, not the orange ones stacked in front of farm stands. These were the leftovers. 720 Cull pumpkins sat in wire bins behind the produce co-op, their stems cracked, their skins scarred, some flattened on one side from sitting too long in the field. Grocery buyers walked past them without even slowing down. The auctioneer lifted his microphone. 720 pumpkins. Last lot. Who wants them? No hands went up. He tried again. Not carving pumpkins. Not display pumpkins. Feed or compost only. Still nothing. A man near the loading dock laughed under his breath. You could bury a tractor under that many. The auctioneer lowered the price. $38 takes the whole lot. That was when Ruth Mercer raised her bidder card. I'll take them. The warehouse went quiet for half a second. Then the laughter started. One grower turned around and squinted at her. Ruth, what are you going to do with 700 pumpkins? She tucked the card back into her coat pocket. Feed my goats. The man laughed harder. Goats don't eat a pumpkin mountain. Ruth only looked at the bins. Not all at once. By sunset, 2 flatbed trailers were crawling up the gravel road to Mercer Ridge Farm, stacked with pumpkins nobody else wanted, and every farmer who had laughed at that auction thought the same thing. She had just paid $38 for a problem. They were wrong, but Ruth would need almost the entire winter to prove it. Mercer Ridge sat above a narrow valley where the soil turned stony after the first foot, and the wind never seemed to stop moving. Ruth raised meat goats there, mostly Boer and Kiko crosses. Tough-footed animals that could climb brushy slopes cattle would ruin in a season. It was not a show farm. It was not a rich farm. It was the kind of place where every gate sagged a little from use. Every bucket had a second job, and every winter forced the same question. How far can the feed last? Ruth had learned that question from her father, Ellis Mercer. When she was 17, a dry spell burned the pasture brown before September. Ruth remembered standing with him beside a stack of hay that looked too small for the animals they had to carry through winter. She asked him what they were going to do. Ellis picked up a handful of dry stems from the barn floor. Then he said, "A farm doesn't survive because it owns plenty. It survives because it notices what still has use." At the time, Ruth thought he meant hay. Years later, she understood he had meant almost everything. The year she bought the pumpkins, the valley was coming off one of the worst hay seasons anyone could remember. June rain never arrived. July heat burned the second cutting. By September, orchard grass bales were selling for nearly twice what they had cost the year before. Every livestock owner was doing the same arithmetic. How many animals could stay? How many bales could be bought? How many bad weeks could the farm absorb before winter turned hard? Ruth did not have room for guesswork. She had 46 goats, 29 breeding does, and a hay barn that looked full only if you had never fed a herd through February. Her husband, Caleb, found her at the kitchen table one night with feed tags, extension bulletins, and a spiral notebook open beside a cold cup of coffee. He leaned in the doorway. "You're studying something expensive." Ruth did not look up. "I'm studying something cheap." "That sounds worse." She smiled a little, but her finger stayed on the page. The article was not about miracles, it was about caution. Pumpkins had moisture, they had fiber, they had digestible energy. They could be useful for goats if they were clean, introduced gradually, and never treated as a replacement for real forage. That last line mattered. Not replacement. Supplement. Ruth wrote it twice in her notebook. The auction happened 3 days later. By the time the trailers reached the farm, Caleb was standing in the yard with both hands on his hips, looking at a wall of orange and green shells. "That is not $38 of feed," he said. Ruth stepped down from the truck. "No." He turned toward her. "Then what is it?" She pulled on her work gloves. It's $38 of work. The work started before breakfast the next morning. Ruth did not dump the pumpkins into the pasture. That was what people imagined when they laughed. A wild pile, a hungry herd, a farmer pretending luck was management. Ruth did the opposite. Every pumpkin was checked by hand. Soft rot went to the compost trench. Mold went out. Anything with a bad smell went out. Only firm flesh and clean rind stayed. Caleb split the pumpkins with a hatchet. Ruth chopped the pieces smaller with a feed knife. Their teenage son, Miles, shoveled the pieces into an old silage tub while their daughter, Lena, mixed in chopped hay and dry oat straw to pull down the moisture. By the end of the first day, their arms ached and the yard smelled like split vines and wet earth. By the end of the third day, orange pulp stuck to the tractor tires. By the end of the sixth day, most of the pumpkin mountain had disappeared into sealed feed bags stacked beside the barn. Caleb wiped his hands on a feed sack. "I understand hay now." Ruth laughed. "You didn't understand hay before. I understood buying it. I didn't understand why the baler always looked tired." The veterinarian stopped by the next week for fall herd checks. Dr. Elaine Porter climbed out of her truck, saw the sealed bags, and paused. "Tell me that is not a pumpkin experiment." Ruth held up both hands. "It is a controlled pumpkin experiment." Elaine walked to the bags, pressed one with her palm, and looked at the ration notes Ruth had taped to the barn wall. Pumpkin, chopped hay, dry straw, free choice minerals, slow introduction, daily inspection. The vet's face changed. Not approval yet, but interest. "You're not replacing hay. No, you're not feeding spoiled fruit. No, you're watching manure and body condition. Every day." Elaine nodded once. "Then I'm not laughing." Caleb smiled. "That makes you the first." She pointed at him. "I did not say I was endorsing it. I said I am not laughing. That was fair. Because the first real test came sooner than Ruth expected. 3 weeks into feeding, one of the bags turned bad. Not all of it. Just one seam where air had gotten inside. The smell hit Ruth before she opened it fully. Sharp, sour in the wrong way. She tied the bag closed and dragged the whole thing away. Caleb stared at it. "That's a lot to throw out." Ruth's jaw tightened. "It's cheaper than a sick herd." By noon, someone at the feed store had already heard about it. By dinner, the story had grown teeth. At the diner the next morning, Dale Pritchard was telling anyone who would listen that Ruth's pumpkins had started rotting in the bags. A farmer at the counter shook his head. "I knew it." Dale stirred his coffee. "You don't feed goats Halloween decorations and call it nutrition." A few people laughed. Then Ruth walked in for salt blocks. The room softened into that country silence where nobody admits they were just talking about you. Dale turned in his chair. "Morning, Ruth. Morning." He cleared his throat. "How's the pumpkin buffet?" Ruth set the salt blocks on the counter. "One bag failed. I threw it out." Dale blinked. "You threw out the whole bag?" "Yes." "Even the good part?" Ruth looked at him. "Especially the good-looking part." The cashier stopped ringing for a second. Ruth paid, picked up the blocks, and added, "Cheap feed only stays cheap if it doesn't make animals sick." Then she left. That line traveled farther than the gossip did. November turned mean. Rain came first, then sleet. Then a week of wind that shoved itself through every crack in the barn. Ruth started the pumpkin ration slowly, a little mixed into hay, then a little more. Never enough to make the goats stop chewing long-stem forage. Never enough to let the sweet smell fool her into thinking she had found a shortcut. The goats loved it. That created its own problem. Goats are experts at making a farmer overconfident. If they like something, they eat like it belongs to them by ancient law. The first morning Ruth fed the mixed ration. The lead doe shouldered 2 younger goats out of the way and buried her nose in the trough. Caleb watched from the gate. "Well, they vote yes." Ruth did not smile yet. "They vote yes on feed sacks too." So she measured, she watched, she adjusted. The droppings stayed firm, the goats kept chewing cud. The hay waste under the feeders dropped fast. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. "Look at the floor." Ruth leaned over the rail. Usually the ground beneath the feeder looked like a bad haircut by evening. Stems pulled out and dropped because the goats had picked through the best leaves. Now there was almost nothing there. The chopped pumpkin made the dry hay smell better, and the hay slowed the pumpkin down. It was not just feeding them. It was making them waste less. By mid-December, Ruth's ledger showed the first real number. They had used 27% less hay than the same weeks the year before. Not because the goats ate less, because they used more of what Ruth gave them. That was the part people missed when they joked about pumpkins. The pumpkins were not magic, they were leverage. Then January came down hard. The valley froze for 17 straight nights. Water tanks skimmed over every morning. Fence latches stuck. A county plow slid sideways near the North Bridge, and hay deliveries backed up for days. At the feed store, the price board changed twice in 1 week. Good hay went from expensive to ugly. Farmers who had laughed in October started buying emergency bales 1 truckload at a time. Dale Pritchard called Caleb one night. "Not Ruth," Caleb answered with 1 boot still on and 1 boot half off. Dale's voice came through tight. "You got extra hay." Caleb looked across the kitchen at Ruth. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "How short are you?" Caleb asked. Short enough to ask. That was the first honest thing anyone had said about the winter. Ruth picked up the phone. "Dale, I don't have much extra hay, but I can show you what we're stretching it with." There was a long pause, then Dale said, "The pumpkins?" "Yes." Another pause. "I don't want to kill my goats." "Neither do I." He came the next morning. The yard was frozen hard enough to wring under his boots. Ruth walked him to the barn and opened one of the good bags. The smell was clean and earthy with a faint sweet edge, not rotten, not sharp, not careless. Dale reached in and squeezed the mixture in his gloved hand. "That's drier than I expected. That's the straw." "And they eat it?" Before Ruth could answer, a red doe pushed her nose through the rail and stole a strand from Dale's glove. He stepped back. "Well," Caleb grinned, "she's our research department." Ruth did not let the moment become a joke. She showed Dale the notebook, how much per head, how slowly she introduced it, what she threw away, what she refused to feed, what signs would make her stop immediately. Dale read longer than Ruth expected. Finally he said, "So the trick is not pumpkins." Ruth closed the notebook. "No, what is it?" "Not getting stupid because something was cheap." By February, the whole valley knew Ruth had not bought emergency hay. That fact bothered people more than the original purchase. A bad idea can be laughed at. A working idea has to be explained. The county extension office called after a feed meeting, where Ruth's name came up 3 times. 2 days later, livestock specialist Owen Grady drove to Mercer Ridge with a clipboard, a sample bag, and the expression of a man trying not to sound impressed too early. He inspected the sealed bags. He checked the discarded pile. He watched the goats eat. He ran his hands over ribs and hips, scoring condition the way livestock people do when they trust bone more than opinion. Finally, he turned to Ruth. "How many bales have you saved?" Caleb answered before she did. "We counted last night." Owen waited. 118. The specialist looked over the herd again. 118 bales? Ruth nodded. Compared with last winter's ewes at the same herd size. And their holding condition. Elaine, the vet, had arrived halfway through the visit. She answered from beside the kidding pen. "Better than holding." Owen wrote that down. Not as a miracle, not as a recommendation for everyone to copy blindly, as a case worth documenting because it proved something precise. Surplus produce could reduce feed pressure if a farmer treated it like a ration problem instead of a dump pile. That word mattered. If. The lowest point of the winter came during the last week of February. A wet snow fell heavy enough to bow the cedar limbs down to the fence wire. One of Ruth's older does, Juniper, went off feed, not dramatically, just enough. The kind of small change a tired farmer might miss at the end of a brutal season. Ruth saw it before breakfast. She pulled Juniper into the kidding stall, checked her temperature, checked her eyelids, checked her rumen movement, and called Dr. Porter before anyone else on the farm had finished coffee. Dale happened to be there, dropping off mineral tubs he owed Caleb for a repair job. He watched Ruth move with a calm that made the barn feel quieter. No panic, no pride, no pretending the system could not fail. Dr. Porter arrived, examined Juniper, and found the problem was not the pumpkin ration at all. A late pregnancy strain, caught early, treatable. By evening, Juniper was chewing again. Dale stood by the gate longer than he needed to. "I thought you were just lucky," he said. Ruth looked toward the doe. "No, I'm watchful." That was the sentence that finally changed him. Because luck does not keep records. Luck does not throw out a suspicious bag. Luck does not notice one doe standing 3 feet away from a feeder while the rest of the herd eats. By March, the feed bags were almost gone. So was the worst of the winter. The first kids arrived in a rainstorm, 2 strong bucklings from a doe named Fern. Then came twins, then triplets, then a long-legged doeling that stood so fast. Caleb laughed out loud. Ruth kept expecting the hard winter to reveal itself somewhere. Lower weights, weak kids, slow mothers, something. But the records told a different story. Fewer problems than the year before, better hay efficiency, steadier body condition, no digestive wreck, no miracle either, just disciplined use of a resource everyone else had written off. When Owen Grady returned with a university forage researcher in April, they spent 3 hours on the farm. They took samples. They photographed the storage. They copied Ruth's ration notes with her permission. They asked what she would do differently. She gave them the answer immediately. Chop smaller, pack tighter, test sooner, and never trust a bag because the outside looks fine. The researcher smiled. That may be the most useful sentence in the report. A month later, the Extension Office published the case study. The headline was modest. Cull pumpkins help goat farm reduce winter hay use. The calls were not modest. Goat producers called. Sheep producers called. A dairy farmer called about rejected squash. A produce co-op in the next county asked whether Cull vegetables could be separated before they spoiled. Ruth answered every person the same way. Research it first. Balance it. Introduce it slowly. Throw out anything questionable. Some callers wanted the easy version. How many pumpkins per goat? How many days? How cheap can winter get? Ruth refused to give the answer they wanted, because the story was never about pumpkins making feed free. It was about a farmer refusing to confuse waste with worthless. By early summer, the produce co-op had changed its routine. Instead of letting usable culls collapse into one bad pile, workers separated firm surplus vegetables into clean bins before rot started. Pumpkins, squash, overgrown zucchini, carrots too crooked for grocery boxes. Farmers still had to know what they were doing. Nobody sensible pretended every rejected vegetable belonged in a feed trough. But the county began to see the back corner of the warehouse differently. Not as trash first. As a question first. Could this still serve? One Saturday, Dale Pritchard stood beside Ruth at the same co-op where the laughter had started. There was another small lot of Cull pumpkins near the loading door. Not 720 this time. Only about 90. Dale looked at them for a long moment. Then he said, "I would have walked past those last year." Ruth smiled. "You did." He gave her a tired look. "I was hoping you forgot that part." "I'm watchful, remember?" He laughed, then shook his head. "I thought you bought pumpkins because you were desperate." Ruth looked through the open loading door toward the trucks, the bins, the bruised vegetables. The work nobody wanted to do until feed got expensive enough. I was desperate. But desperation only helps if it makes you careful. By the end of the season, Ruth's ledger showed the final proof. 121 fewer bales used across the winter. Nearly $3,000 in feed costs avoided. A kidding season stronger than the one before it. And a produce co-op that no longer treated every ugly vegetable as a disposal problem. That was what the auction crowd had missed. They saw pumpkins with scarred skins. They saw bins nobody wanted. They saw a woman paying $38 for a mess. Ruth saw moisture, energy, fiber, risk, work, limits, and possibility. Good farming was never just the art of growing things. It was the discipline of not wasting what could still carry life.